Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to another episode of the Word of the Day podcast, where useful words are pleasantly explained. My name is Jamie Silva. I am your host, and you know what? Enough messing around. Let's get right into today's word, which is the verb ingratiate. Now, this word typically appears in conjunction with the words himself, herself, themselves, or oneself. And in my view, it means to try to get on someone's good side by being especially nice to them. And this could be via words, behavior, actions, grand gestures, or what have you. So, by way of example, let's say a family moved in next door to you, and you knocked on their door one morning with a plate of fresh-baked cookies, and warmly welcomed them to the neighborhood. Well, that act, that attempt to get your neighbor to like you by being really nice to them, that is ingratiation. And ingratiation, by the way, is just the noun form of the verb ingratiate. Here's the online definition for comparison. Quote, to bring oneself into favor with someone by flattering or trying to please them, unquote. So, bring oneself into favor with it's kind of a weird way to put it. No one says that, but that aside, this is basically fine. Now, there are a lot of phrases out there with sort of similar meanings to ingratiate, and I would imagine that you've used a fair number of them in ordinary conversation yourself before, because some of them are pretty common. See for yourself. The list of similar phrases goes like this. Flatter, curry favor with. Win over, get on the good side of, get in someone's good books, get in the good graces of, grovel to, toady to, kiss up to, bow and scrape to, play up to, pander to, be a sycophant to, be obsequious to, be a yes man to, and dance attendance on. Now, these phrases aren't perfectly equivalent to ingratiate, and some of them actually mean fairly different things depending on the context, but they're all pretty much in the same ballpark. Now, at this point, ordinarily we would talk about the etymology of ingratiate and take a look at its origin. But we looked into the origin, and it turns out it's not very interesting. So instead, let's dash straight on to several important usage tips for ingratiate. First, as suggested by the fact that ingratiate pairs well with words like oneself and himself and herself and so on, I would argue that you could only ingratiate your own self to someone. Like, you can't ingratiate other people to still other people. And I know that that's kind of confusing, so let me break it down some. So think of the stereotype of the wingman, right? Which is like a guy's friend who tries to help him win over a girl that he wants to go out with. And this guy, the guy who needs a wingman, he might be ineffectively trying to ingratiate himself to the girl in question by, let's say, nodding pleasantly at her from the other end of the bar. But he's too shy to actually walk over and say hello. His friend, on the other hand, his wingman, will be over there introducing himself, smiling and laughing, and dropping hints about the other guy, the shy guy's fascinating hobbies, lucrative line of work, and recent adoption of a rescue insert cute dog breed here puppy. So getting back to ingratiate, the wingman may be doing a great job, right? But in my opinion, he's not ingratiating himself, or at least that's not his goal, nor is he ingratiating his timid buddy. The purpose and the process of what's going on are very similar, but just the word ingratiate doesn't fit quite right. Because remember, it presupposes that you yourself are in charge of the ingratiating, and are directly ingratiating yourself to someone else. And this might seem like a technicality, but I think that's just how it works. The second usage tip is this. In my opinion, most of the time, you gotta say who you're ingratiating yourself to. Like, the target can't just be humanity at large or an unspecified person or persons. Although, and I guess this is sort of an exception, you can refer to someone's ingratiating smile or their ingratiating demeanor, which, depending on the context, might suggest that this person is trying to ingratiate themselves all the time to everyone, just as a matter of course, which is honestly a little weird and suspicious. But this isn't as common a usage, I don't think. Okay, let's turn now to the third usage note for ingratiate. In nearly all cases, you're going to be ingratiating yourself to someone you don't know very well, probably because you only met them recently. Of course, there may be people you technically met long ago, but never really spoke to or got to know, and are only just now trying to be friends with. But this, I think, is just semantics. Like the situation here is basically the same. Ingratiation is very much geared to first impressions, or at least close to first, like among your first few impressions of someone. Now, a few people that I talked to about this word argued that if you know someone very well, like they're a good friend or a family member or a spouse, and say you offend them, and then you try to be super nice to them afterwards in order to smooth things over and get back on their good side, like they say that surely that act qualifies as ingratiation. And honestly, I feel like I have to give some ground on this, or at least concede that it's up to you. Like if you really want to use ingratiate in that setting, like go ahead. But at minimum, I think I can say that the first impressions setting is a much more common one. Like if you recall the bringing cookies to your neighbor example that we started out with, I think this fits ingratiate perfectly because the neighbor is new, you don't know each other well yet, and you want to start off on the right foot. Okay, now on to the fourth usage tip, which is more than we usually have, I realize, but this word it's just that special, I guess. Here it is. Ingratiation, in my view, does not imply success. Like, it does not mean that you do indeed win someone over or get in their good graces. Rather, in most cases, I think ingratiate emphasizes the attempt part. Like, maybe your ingratiation efforts pay off and the target ends up thinking you're the bee's knees, but that's not baked into the word itself. Ingratiation is about the process and not so much the result. And we are still not done here. There is a fifth usage tip, and this one I think is perhaps the most interesting. So, in general, I would say that you try to ingratiate yourself to people who it is in your interest that they like you. Like you're not just being friendly to them because you're a friendly person all the time. You might really be a friendly person, but when you're ingratiating yourself to someone, you're being extra friendly because you have an incentive to do so. And maybe that incentive is specific, like, if I'm nice to this person who has season tickets to my favorite local semi-pro lacrosse team, then maybe you'll invite me along to a game sometime. Or the incentive could be more general, like, I may as well try to get along real well with my coworkers because I've got to work with them every day, and it would be harder to do that if they didn't like me. Now, because of this having an incentive to be nice angle, many argue that ingratiate has inherently negative connotations. Like if you're just trying to get on someone's good side because you expect to achieve something or get something by doing so, that doesn't seem very nice, now does it, right? It seems more manipulative. But looking deeper, I think whether or not ingratiate is pejorative depends very much on the situation. So if you think of like a con artist who's being extremely nice to a kindly old lady so that he can win her confidence and scam her out of her vast wealth, obviously that's a situation where ingratiation is being used for evil, and suspicion is warranted. On the other hand, in the work example, if you're being nice to your colleagues in order to get along with them and therefore be able to do your job more effectively, I have no problem with that. Like, in a world where not having had your morning cup of coffee is a legitimate and socially accepted reason to be kind of snippy, I say the more reasons people have to be nice, whether they want to or not, the better. I think arguably this is just called being polite, or in an office setting, it's being professional, right? You try to get along with people and get on their good side a little bit, even if you're not that thrilled about it or aren't that thrilled about them as a person. It's just the proper thing to do. Now, here's another scenario that I think perfectly illustrates the blurry line between ingratiation as sneaky manipulation and ingratiation as straight-up politeness. What about if you go to meet your boyfriend or girlfriend's family, right? Especially their parents. If you don't do your darndest to ingratiate yourself to them, I don't know what you're doing. Like, do you want this to work out or not? And you might try to do so. You might try to ingratiate yourself by, let's say, learning everyone's names, bringing a bottle of wine if you're over for dinner, laughing at everyone's jokes, complimenting their lovely house, offering to put in a good word for young Jimmy at your office so maybe he'll get that internship he's been looking for, saying it's no wonder your significant other is so awesome, seeing as how they came from such an awesome household, and so on. Now, all of this, I think, is totally cool, totally normal, and also it is ingratiation to the max, right? So, in my book, that is another point for ingratiation as not necessarily pejorative. Oh, and one other quick thought before we get to the examples. One of the most common settings I see people trying to ingratiate themselves is to animals. Not just with their own pets either, but with anyone's pets. Animal lovers will go to tremendous lengths to curry favor with, flatter, get in the good graces of those pets, etc. I'm sure you've all seen what this looks like because it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. You also see this behavior in how some people interact with babies, but honestly, I think it's even more common and more fashionable to do this with pets and animals. Okay, it's now time to take a look at some examples of how ingratiate appears in literature. The first comes from the book Emma by Jane Austen. Here, Emma, the main character, of course, is talking to her friend Harriet, who she's trying to set up with this guy they both know, Mr. Elton. And we'll start with Emma speaking. Quote, "In one respect, perhaps, Mr. Elton's manners are superior to Mr. Knightley's or Mr. Weston's. They have more gentleness. I think a young man might be very safely recommended to take Mr. Elton as a model. Mr. Elton is good-humored, cheerful, obliging, and gentle. He seems to me to be grown particularly gentle of late. I do not know whether he has any design of ingratiating himself with either of us, Harriet, by additional softness, but it strikes me that his manners are softer than they used to be. If he means anything, it must be to please you." Harriet blushed and smiled, and said she had always thought Mr. Elton very agreeable. Unquote. Example number 2 comes somewhat paraphrased from An Anonymous Story by Anton Chekhov. And to be clear, I'm not just being secretive here. That is actually the title. It's just called An Anonymous Story. Quote, "Kukushkin went into the house with a sly, oily look in his eyes, smiling mysteriously and rubbing his hands, which were cold from the frost. 'I have the honor to congratulate you,' he said to Orloff, shaking all over with ingratiating, obsequious laughter. 'May you increase and multiply like the cedars of Lebanon.'" Unquote. Our final example comes, also paraphrased in spots, from the book The Shuttle by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Quote, "Mrs. Brent admired Betty hugely. 'You seem so unlike an American,' she said once, in her most tactful, ingratiating manner, which was very ingratiating indeed. 'Do I?' said Betty. 'What is one like when one is like an American? I am one, you know.' 'I can scarcely believe it,' replied Mrs. Brent. 'Pray try,' said Betty with simple brevity, and Mrs. Brent felt that perhaps Betty was not really very easy to get along with. As Betty recounted the interview to Rosie later, Mrs. Brent meant to imply that I did not speak through my nose, or talk too much, or talk too vivaciously in a shrill voice. I like to convince myself that that is not one's sole national characteristic. Also, it was not exactly Mrs. Brent's place to kindly encourage me with the information that I do not seem to belong to my own country." Okay, folks, that is it for the examples, but before we go, it's time for another edition of our ever-popular segment, Not in Stock, in which we tell you about a revolutionary new product or service that unfortunately isn't available right now in the official Word of the Day online store, which you can always find at wotdpodcast.com/merchandise. Today, the Word of the Day podcast is proud to present the world's very first self-serving coffee machine. A couple clarifications up front. By self-serving coffee machine, we do not mean self-service, like in those coffee shops in San Francisco where the barista is a robot. No, this is the self-serving coffee machine. Second clarification. This also does not mean that the machine serves itself coffee. That would be, of course, very strange. Once again, no, we mean something entirely different, and here's what that is. Google defines the adjective self-serving as, quote, having concern for one's own welfare and interests before those of others, unquote. So, to elaborate, self-serving people always ask, what's in it for me, before they do anything. And similarly, while they may appear to be acting altruistically and doing things for other people, often they have a hidden agenda, or a way in which they also benefit, which of course should be ringing some bells from the discussion of Ingratiate that we just concluded. So, for example, when we urge you, the listeners, to tell your friends about this show, so that these friends will listen themselves, and come away with a larger vocabulary, a greater appreciation for the English language, and a higher regard for you personally, for doing them the great favor of turning them on to this fine program. When we exhort you to do this, all of it may be true in a sense, and we might be quite sincere, but also we must admit we are being self-serving, because obviously it is in our interests as a show to have more listeners. This is reminiscent, by the way, of the logic behind the word ostensibly, which we covered in a recent episode, so check that out if you haven't already. Which, again, me saying that is self-serving, right? Because that is another download for us if you do so. Now, as you can probably tell, this adjective, self-serving, is not a compliment. It's almost always pejorative. With this knowledge in hand, let's return to the product. The Word of the Day self-serving coffee machine will make you a great cup of coffee every morning, as long as you first make it clear to the coffee machine, like, what's in it for them. Once you do, it'll happily brew you as many cups of Joe as you like. Or is it Cup of Joes? Or Cuppas Joe? Like Attorneys General? I'm actually not quite sure. But anyway, let's talk about another way this connects to today's word. Theoretically, if you wanted to play hardball with the coffee machine, you could be like, oh, you want to know what's in it for you? Okay, let's see here. How about this? You make me a cup of coffee, or I toss you in the garbage. Or are you recyclable? I'm not sure. From your perspective, I don't think it matters. So, you could do this, but you wouldn't, right? Because you're a nice person. So instead, you might make it clear to the coffee machine that, well, if it helps you out, then you'll be nice to it. And what better way to do this than to, wait for it, ingratiate yourself to the machine. By cleaning it thoroughly after each use, using only the freshest coffee beans and the finest roasts, not insulting it by using it to brew decaf blends, and showing it off to your friends when they visit. If you do these sorts of things, our self-serving coffee machine, which, by the way, comes with patented sulking and silent treatment capabilities hardwired in, it'll get over its initial hostility. It'll understand that you have an incentive to be nice to it, and that it, in turn, has an incentive to cooperate, and it'll loosen up and be a fantastic product. And now, the fine print. For all the other products in the wonderful Word of the Day online store, there is a money-back guarantee, saying that if, for whatever reason, you're not happy with your purchase, you get a full refund, no questions asked. But for the self-serving coffee machine, it's a little different. It works like this. Before getting your refund, you'll have to answer a series of questions about how you treated the self-serving coffee machine, and whether your behavior was sufficiently friendly and ingratiating. If our pleasant and capable customer service representatives, who are also licensed family therapists, determine that you didn't do a very good job of this, they will regretfully decline to issue your refund, and instead recommend that you redouble your efforts to ingratiate yourself to the self-serving coffee machine, perhaps with a grand gesture of goodwill, like, I don't know, let's say purchasing a Word of the Day self-serving espresso machine for it to hang out with. And now comes the part I warned you was coming. I must regretfully inform you that this revolutionary new product isn't for sale in our online store at present. As it happens, our engineers have not yet been able to convince the prototype self-serving coffee machine that it is in its interest to be mass-produced. Now, as soon as we get that little hiccup sorted out, it will be ready to ship. So, in the meantime, keep refreshing the Word of the Day online store, which, again, you can always find at wotdpodcast.com/merchandise. Well, with that, this episode of the Word of the Day podcast is drawing to a close. We very much hope you enjoyed it, and we are grateful that you tuned in. For now, I'm your host, Jamie Silva, saying so long from the RAV4 studios. We hope you have a great, and we'll see you next time.